So in this video, we're going to talk about active choices using shutter speed and aperture. Um, so let's say that you're at the beach and there's people there with some dogs and the dogs are running around. And so you have to ask yourself, you're standing there with your camera or your camera phone, and you have to ask yourself, what's more important to you? Is capturing motion more important to you? Or is having greater depth of field or shallow depth of field more important to you? So if you want to get some pictures of dogs running around, it might be motion that's more important to you. If you want to get a portrait of just people standing there with their dogs, or maybe a picture of the entire beach, as a landscape, then depth of field will be more important to you. So let's say you're standing there, we'll go through this decision tree. Motion is more important to you. Then you have a next set of decisions to make. Do you care more about frozen motion? A dog's jumping up in the air and catching a frisbee, and you want to freeze that in time? Or do you want an artsy blurred motion photo? The owner is standing there still with the dog running around, but you want a blur of fur. So let's say you want that frozen motion. The dog is jumping up and catching a frisbee, or it's frolicking in the waves and the waves are crashing, and you really want to get those droplets of water and the dog frozen, kind of hanging in the air. Then the next decision you make is whether you want to do half the work or all the work. So I'm going to talk about using a camera, but also your phone. So if you use your camera, you put it on S or TV. There's, usually a little dial on top with your manual settings. So S for shutter, if it's a Nikon, TV for time variable, if it's a Canon. You want to choose a high denominator. So something like 1/250th of a second, 1/500th of a second, 1/1000th of a second, 1/2000th of a second. And then the camera will pick the aperture that lets in the correct amount of light for a correct exposure. How does it do that? Well, it uses a light meter that's built into the camera. You'll be able to see it actually, usually on the back of the camera. So it has +1, +2, +3, -1, -2, -3. If the camera is letting in too much light, then it will be on the plus side. And if this little line here was over on the plus side, it would be letting in too much light, and you would have an overexposed and too bright photo. If it was on the minus side, this little line, that would indicate that you're not letting in enough light, and it's going to be underexposed and be too dark. So you want that line to be in the middle. But fortunately, if you put it on what's called shutter priority mode, S or TV, you choose the shutter, the camera chooses the aperture to make sure that that line is in the middle and it is correctly exposed. But most professional photographers want to have complete control. They don't want the camera making decisions. So they are going to put it in manual and choose a higher denominator, right? Just like if you were doing half the work, you still choose a higher denominator. But then you would have to pick the aperture that works. So you would pick different apertures, and some of them would be like you'd pick one and it'd say, oh, it's +2. And you'd say, oh, I'm letting in too much light. I need to choose like a smaller aperture that lets in less light. And or if you're not letting in enough light, you'll have to pick a bigger aperture that lets in more light. And you use this as your guide to try to get you to the correct exposure. So that's how you do it on a camera. On a phone, you can use the Lightroom mobile app. You put it in professional mode. You go to SEC, so sec, for seconds, and that allows you to choose the denominator. So when you're on the phone, in Lightroom mobile app, it kind of works like this, like the shutter priority. You choose the shutter speed, and the camera will choose the aperture to give the correct exposure. There are other apps on your phone, usually that you have to pay for, that will allow you to shoot fully manual. I mean, it does like an approximation kind of the aperture, but still, I believe there's ones out there that will let you choose both the shutter speed and the aperture. All right, so let's go back. You've taken some frozen motion. Now you want to get a little artsy. You want to take those blurred motion photos. So now you're still working with your shutter speed, but this time, if you want to do half the work, put it into that shutter priority and you choose a lower denominator. So something like 1/60th of a second, 1/30th of a second, 1/15th of a second, but make sure to hold that camera still so you don't get overall blur. You only want the things that are moving blur. So hold that camera still. And again, when you have it in uh, shutter priority, the camera will choose the correct aperture. Same thing with manual. You choose the lower denominator, but then you have to use that light meter to choose an aperture that works to get that correct amount of light going in. All right. You've taken your pictures of the dogs running around. Someone sees that you're taking photos and says, "Oh, will you take a portrait of me and my dog? I would love it so much." Whatever, that would be so wonderful. Maybe you know the person. So then you realize, okay, I'm not dealing with shutter speed anymore. My focus needs to be aperture. And they want a portrait. So shallow depth of field is great for a portrait because it really makes the person pop out from the background. So you decide to do shallow depth of field. So now you could use uh, aperture priority. So if you're using a camera, you put it to A or AV, and you choose a lower f-stop, something like f1.4, f1.8, f2.2, f3.5, something like that. And again, because it's in priority mode, the camera will pick the shutter speed this time using that light meter to let in the correct amount of light. But maybe you want to have complete control. And so you put it on manual and you choose a lower f stop, but then you have to choose a shutter speed that works. Again, using this as your guide to let in the correct amount of light. And then after you take those, maybe you want to get, a picture of the entire beach. It's really beautiful. There's some rocks in the background, some trees at the side, the ocean, the people, the dogs. And so you decide, hey, I want everything in focus. There's things different distance away from me. I would just want everything in focus. So you choose greater depth of field. On your camera, you choose AV or A, so aperture variable or aperture. Choose a higher f-stop, something like f11, f16, f22. The camera will pick the shutter. Or you can put it on manual and you pick both using this as your guide to get the correct exposure. Now, in terms of your phone, like an iPhone, for shallow depth of field, you put it on portrait mode. And up in the upper right hand corner, you'll have the f stops. You can click on like the little f stop symbol, and then there'll be like a little roller about 1/3 up from the bottom of the screen, and you can choose your f stop. One really good piece of advice is don't shoot at that lowest f stop, that 1.4 or whatever it is, because it looks really fake. Because again, your phone is faking shallow depth of field. It uses like AI, um, and it's not like real depth of field having to do with your lenses and distance and stuff. So, so you would choose an f-stop in portrait mode, but instead of choosing that lowest one, I would like dial it down a little bit and choose something more like f2.2, f3, something like around there, and it'll look more realistic, like it was taken with a camera. Um, and if you're shooting greater depth of field, you don't want to shoot in portrait mode. In fact, you want to put it in regular mode and focus. So click and hold your finger kind of on something that's farther away, and that will help force greater depth of field. But to be honest, greater depth of field is usually what your camera wants to be shooting in anyway on your phone. So it's really not that hard to get greater depth of field. But if somehow it's giving you kind of a shallow depth of field, again, just focus on something that's farther away. So these are just kind of all the decisions, those active choices, and why you make them and how you make them. If you have any questions, just please don't hesitate to contact me.